Hey, I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion. South Park has been on the air for a long time, 27 years. But never have people been talking about it as much as they are right now. Their attacks on Trump, J.D. Vance, Kristi Noem, even Paramount, the network that puts them on the air, are pretty vicious. And, even though going for the cultural jugular is what they're known for, this time it feels different. Kathryn VanArendonk is here. Ashley Ray is here. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Well, we are patiently waiting for another week for that third episode of this season, but let's give people a taste of episode 1 if they haven't seen it.
Hey, Satan!
I don't want to right now.
What? Hey, relax! Come on, Satan, I've been working hard all day.
You haven't been working, you've been doing your stupid memes and just around.
Come here again. Come on, Satan. You know you can't resist this.
For those of you who'd like an image, that was a naked Donald Trump in bed with Satan. Kathryn, let me start with you. Trump has famously been an object of great difficulty for comedians. I remember Armando Iannucci famously in 2019 had said, how do you parody somebody who is self-parodying? And relevant to this conversation, as recently as last fall, South Park's creators said in Vanity Fair, I don't know what more we could possibly say about Trump. So what's changed?
A couple things have changed. Most notably, he was reelected. I mean, it's a pretty big and monumental shift. And I think the other thing is that that election has forced a lot of people to realize that this administration does not seem to be operating the same way, in a lot of the same ways that the first Trump administration did. It is much more extreme. A lot of the sort of guardrails that were in place that first time around have been removed. And so suddenly there is this acceleration of a lot of things that that people were sort of hoping they would not actually have to deal with. So I think that's the first thing. The other really important thing that has changed is that since that first statement that they were like, I'm not sure what else to say about Trump, South Park and Paramount came to this really important deal where it was like over $1 billion deal for all streaming rights to South Park and streaming rights to future episodes that they're going to promise to make. And then in almost the same week, Paramount fired Stephen Colbert and ended his late night show because they were allegedly to appease the Trump administration to get this merger done. And so South Park, suddenly the creators found themselves in this place where they had just gotten all of this money from this corporate overlord who is then making deals with this administration that is doing a lot of things that really bothers them.
Exciting times? ? Ashley, the first 2 episodes have taken aim at the Trump administration, ICE, and South Park's current network, Paramount. Any favorite moments that stick out for you so far?
Yeah, I have to go with the Paramount, just everything. For a lot of the reasons that Kathryn said, I think a lot of people who work with Paramount, who are artists, are frustrated that they capitulated to the Trump administration so quickly. And I don't think South Park necessarily feels that they need to speak truth to power, but I do think they like to say the things people aren't saying. And in this case, I think everyone was shocked that people just kind of rolled over and were like, okay, Trump doesn't want Stephen Colbert. Paramount's going to do what he wants, and that's how we're going to move forward. And I think South Park just saw a place where they could go, someone needs to say something about this. We want to make fun of it, and now we've been pulled into it. So I think they were forced to kind of talk about Trump, and I mean, just making fun of Paramount. I love it. I love it. I loved it when they did it on the rehearsal. I just think we're also frustrated that they've become this example of how people are just going along with this second Trump administration.
Yeah, Kathryn, any favorite moments for you?
Yeah, I want to echo what Ashley said, because for me, the this instinct to sort of push back against your parent company has more potential impact, I think, than a lot of the jokes about Trump or about Kristi Noem. It is the kind of thing that we have this longing for somebody to finally like get to Trump in a way that like will mean something, and then suddenly everyone's going to be like, "Wow, actually, I do think he's bad." But everything that we have learned about from the last 10 years is that those kinds of attacks don't have much purchase, and so material that is less about Trump in bed with Satan and more about how cowardly and frustrating it is to have appeased him feels more meaningful to me. I similarly jokes about what Kristi Noem looks like I find easy, right? Whereas jokes about the damage that ICE does to your neighborhood much more rooted in something that could change people's minds.
Yeah. Ashley, you mentioned that they haven't always spoke truth to power on South Park. I think this is a very interesting part of what South Park is doing right now. What would you say the South Park audience looks like now versus what they looked like 27 years ago when they started?
Yeah, I feel like I came of age at the right time for South Park. I was in middle school, which I think is the show's still just main audience. But I was in middle school, Bush was in office, and it felt like the show that gave me a voice when I had issues with politics that I didn't understand as a kid. I was like, this gets it. Like, I am mad about this war, and here's a show that is saying this. And I think in its original formation, it was a little let's speak truth to power and point out things that are ridiculous. But as the culture shifted and things became more liberal and Obama got into office, South Park, I think, understood that their role was to then question that voice being in sort of authority and to really become that voice of just the contrarian of, hey, this is what people are afraid to talk about, afraid to say. And I think with the rise of more liberal television shows on Comedy Central, like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Colbert Report getting popular, South Park said, hey, we can kind of be the other side of that, and we can stand up for the guys who are like, well, why can't I say the R word? Why can't I do this anymore? And point out how, maybe sometimes these guys are just saying all this stuff because they want to smell their own farts and it's not so serious. And so I think they became this show that the right wing embraced and thought was on their side. And the show was like happy to cater to those sort of like shock jock dudes. And now I think they realize they've created this audience that isn't really understanding what they intend to do, that now that they want to take aim at Trump, it's not out of admiration.
Right.
And I think this audience refuses to see that they are being made fun of because they see South Park as being on their side.
Well, yeah, not just the audience, but the aims themselves, the targets, I should say. J.D. Vance is being mocked on South Park and then says, hey, I finally made it. David Ellison, who's that new CEO of Paramount, he's been a fan his whole life. He's loving all this mockery of Paramount. So then you have to ask, how effective are these attacks if many of these nations, currently most influential people grew up on these series and not only that, but idolize its, naughtiness and the defiance of PC culture. Is it effective?
Yeah, to me, I don't feel that South Park can be effective until they take on their own role in how they created this mess. I think when they can make fun of themselves, I'll be a little bit more convinced that this isn't just, hey, we're getting attention for making fun of Paramount right now. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, they really understand their role in creating our current situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, until that, I'm just kind of like, you're just going to keep making jokes that the right loves, and this isn't really going to become anything else.
And on that note of people creating their own mess that they now find themselves in, episode 2 of this season skewers the rise of these podcast bros like Joe Rogan, Charlie Kirk. And on that note, comedian podcaster Marc Maron has been doing the media rounds. He's got a new HBO special. He's ending his podcast. And I just wanted to play this clip. This is Marc Maron asking why these comics tend to kick their targets when they're down.
It's like they won. Trans people are frightened. They have no ability to get health care anymore. And they're afraid of being alive and have no freedom left. So that's done. When do you stop with the jokes?
When do you stop with the joke?
And like immigrants, okay, well, they're being ripped away from their homes, and yeah, and they're all terrified, and okay, so that's done. When do you stop with the jokes?
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to pick on the vulnerable and the marginalized, but I mean, they're down.
That was Marc Maron. And then that was Bobby Lee in the background going, right, as though it's some sort of revelation that he's heard for the first time. But Kathryn, what does it mean for Marc Maron to be saying this?
I think it is important for actually a tiny bit of the same reason it is actually a little useful for South Park to be doing the same thing, which is this sense of somebody who has been in the in-group, this sort of bro-y podcaster space, who people respect, who people like, saying like, actually, guys, like we probably need to be thinking about the impact of what we have been saying on people in the audience and in people who we are making fun of. And there is more purchase when somebody like Marc Maron does this than when comedians who have not been in those same alt comedians, queer comedians who have been saying these kinds of things for a long time. Unfortunately, it's very easy for like clubby bro podcasters to be like, okay, whine more, right? And when somebody like Maron stands up and says, no, I am one of you, and this is something that we are doing that is wrong, people listen more than they have been, I think.
Yeah. Ashley, you are, like myself, a comedian. And you know, I used to feel this about music, particularly hip hop. I always felt like musicians should acknowledge the power they have. They should, acknowledge some responsibility for certain things societally with all that money, with all that influence. Do you feel that way about comedians? Should they be acknowledging the power they have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're at a point where it's clear, and people like Joe Rogan want to deny the power they have. They want to say it doesn't mean anything when Kill Tony actually performs at a Trump rally. It doesn't mean we're just jesters. It's just entertainment. But when Dave Chappelle's specials are shaping how people see trans people, you have power, and you have to acknowledge that, and you have to be aware of how you're using it, because they like to say we're helping break boundaries down and we're keeping free speech free. But like Kathryn said, queer comedians who have been saying all this stuff for a long time are marginalized and hated on. You know, Marc Maron can say this, but if a queer comic had said this, they would be hated on they would probably not even be able to open their Twitter for a while, because these podcast bro fans would come for them. So they don't want to acknowledge that. They don't want to sort of admit that they have this influence, I think, because then they have to answer some really horrible questions about who they are and their morals and how much money really means to them, because I think that's the motivating focus.
Yeah, I've got a couple of minutes left, but I do want to ask you both this question. You know, I'd mentioned off the top that Trump, you know, he's so absurdist that he was almost joke-proof for a little, for many people, especially in the comedy world, people who, you know, make money off of making jokes of those in power. The New Yorker asked this question, and I wanted to put it to you. How do you make boundary-pushing comedy if there are no longer any boundaries? Kathryn, let me ask you first.
It is, if I knew the answer to that question, I assume I would be much more wealthy and famous than I am.
Hopefully we'd still have you on the show. You wouldn't turn your nose up.
Oh, of course. No, I'm never leaving. This is a delight every time. But I do think it has become really important, and I think fascinating to watch how much people are excited when South Park pushes at Paramount, when Marc Maron turns around and says, hey, like, let's think about our own power in these roles. And so rather than just pointing at Trump all the time, I do think self-reflection is a route to some kind of this boundary pushing thing that that audiences are excited about.
Yeah. Ashley?
I mean, I think it's interesting because I think there are still boundaries. Like we've said, queer, Black comedians, there are things we can't say or talk about without facing some punishment or pushback in the industry. So when they're talking about we're removing boundaries, it's a little like, well, what are those boundaries that you feel need to be removed? Is it just the right to like say the R word and to say slurs? Are those the boundaries? Because it doesn't seem like it is removing boundaries to actually allow comedians to discuss more or to really inspire change. So to me personally, it's kind of like, you know, I don't need these boundaries so I can like punch at people. I want to remove boundaries so that, you know, I can be more honest about myself to audiences. And it seems like they just want to remove these boundaries so they can pick at whoever they want to.
Right on. A great chat. I wish we had more time. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Kathryn VanArendonk is the TV critic for the New York Magazine's Vulture site, and Ashley Ray is a comedian, writer, and podcaster in LA. I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This is Commotion, and you are about to hear a lot more about writer Maria Reva. The Ukrainian-Canadian published her first novel this summer. It's called Endling, and it swiftly made the Booker Prize longlist. That is an international award worth over $90,000, if you're not aware, and only a small handful of Canadians have ever won that. Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, and Yann Martel. Carole V. wrote a glowing review of Maria Reva's absurdist novel for the LA Times. Carole, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the title of this book, Endling. Can you describe what an endling is? What makes it a fitting title for this novel?
Sure. An endling is essentially the last of a dying species that's on the brink of extinction. So the title is like simple, but it's profound because it creates a sense of existential crisis, both material and very specific, because a main character in the book is a scientist who's trying to preserve a number of species of dying species of snails. But it's also symbolic, and it works on multiple levels because you have Yeva, the scientist, whose life's mission is to save these hundreds of species of endangered snails. But then you also have this sort of whole kidnapping plot and sort of caper taking place against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so you have an existential crisis for the characters that are in the novel as well, whose lives are in danger. And then I think for me, by the end of the novel, it really also worked on this broader level of making me aware. And it really resonated in terms of sort of like broader geopolitical conflicts and feeling a sense of jeopardy. I think that there's a feeling right now of a lot of things sort of like being on the brink of extinction. So for me, it just really resonated. Beautifully.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a disservice to call it an absurdist novel. And yes, for sure, you know, with all the snail sex happening, there is some absurdity happening, but there's some real stuff happening too. Just to dig into a little bit more of the absurdism, though, you mentioned the main character, Yeva. She funds her research by working for a company called Romeo and Julia. It's a mail-order bride service for men who are seeking Ukrainian wives. She meets a pair of sisters who rope her into kidnapping a group of hopeful grooms. Tell me, what are they trying to get out of holding these foreign bachelors hostage?
So they have different objectives. The two sisters, one is really in charge. The second sister is named Solomia, and she's sort of there to try to save her sister from herself. But the driving force is Anastasia, or she goes by Nastia. And her plot is really to call attention to the exploitation and the problems and the sexism and the really problematic nature of what they call the romance tour industry in Ukraine. And it's sort of like a mail order service, but really these men come over to the Ukraine and they sort of spend weeks there shopping, meeting these women and sort of shopping for a Ukrainian bride. And they have all of these preconceptions about why Ukrainian women would be a more ideal match for them than the women from the countries that they are, or that they hail from.
Yeah, in fact, pardon me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but on that note, Maria Reva was on Seth Meyers recently on the Late Night Talk Show talking a little bit about that. Let's have a listen to that before we go on.
My sister, Anna Podgorna, she's a renowned composer. So she was, on the plane heading to Princeton for her PhD program, and she was seated next to an American man. And as soon as she mentioned that she was born in Ukraine, so we were both born in Ukraine, the first thing he said was, "Oh gosh, I would really love a Ukrainian girl as a wife because American women are so ambitious and aggressive."
Wow. There are some of those preconceived notions that you spoke about, Carole. That was Maria Reva herself on Seth Meyers talking about her book and the inspirations for it. So Maria was born in Ukraine, but raised in Canada, now lives in Vancouver. Vancouver features in this book. Mm-hmm. And Russia invaded Ukraine as she was also writing the novel, and that ongoing war also ended up in this book. And that's some of the reality that I was mentioning and you were mentioning. Tell me how the ongoing war played a role in Endling.
So the war really does break out during the action of the novel. So this kidnapping plot is happening. The troops have been on the border for a while, but everyone, as we so often do, we sort of try to get used to the new status quo. And we believe, human beings tend to believe that it's not going to really get worse. The worst is not going to happen. So Yeva, the scientist, definitely thinks that the worst is going to happen, but everyone else is like, oh, it's just a show. It's just a show. And so when this kidnapping happens, it's really interesting. There's a sense of unreality. They're using this caravan that's really Yeva, the scientist's mobile lab where she keeps her snails. But they're using that to house these bachelors that they've kidnapped. And Yeva has determined that you can safely and responsibly kidnap around like less than a dozen men and have them healthily housed in this caravan. So the men are sort of cut off from reality, but also they are sort of cut off from reality as they're on their trek. And when war breaks out, they really don't believe it's happening. And that's such an interesting sort of resonance, because before war broke out, everyone was poo-pooing the idea that that could ever happen. But then when it breaks out, they still can't believe it's really happening. And there's so much play between reality and media and perception. There's like this really interesting interplay with people having a really hard time to adjusting that this is their new reality. And there's even a scene in the novel that is so meta. I mean, it's also already a metafictional novel because the author breaks through sometimes and comments. But there's this scene in which they are in an area of Ukraine in the caravan, and the troops are there. And the men, when they see this, they actually think it's a setup. It's part of the setup. It's part of, they don't even really believe they're being kidnapped. They think this is part of the show. They think the military is like part of a ruse, right? To sort of like set them up and get them freaked out. So there's this really interesting interplay all the time between the blurring lines of fiction and reality.
Yeah, you mentioned this is a very interesting part of the book, and I wasn't able to finish it completely, but I saw this talking directly to the reader and breaking down the fourth wall. That is, she does that to justify her sense of humor, I think. Is that correct?
That's absolutely one of the things that is a main topic. And it's so interesting because I've no doubt that this is based on, things that really happened to her. Because, I mean, even though the author breaks through, at the same time, as a critic, I try not to assume that everything that I think of the author as another character, essentially. And I don't assume that the author is exactly Maria telling the exact truth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But she's absolutely drawing on her own story. But in the book, she has these letters back and forth between her and publishers who want her to give the perspective of a Ukrainian, because the author Maria Reva is a Ukrainian Canadian citizen. She migrated to Canada from Ukraine.
Yeah.
When she was young. And so she's asked to give this perspective on the war. And she writes something that has a lot of humor in it. And so she gets this response back from the publisher that's like, oh, this is inappropriate. I don't, this is very serious. I want you to have an authentic view from the perspective of a Ukrainian, but not that way. And then
Carole, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. We're almost out of time.
Okay.
But I want to point listeners and viewers towards your article. Thank you so much for your time today. Carole V. Bell is a cultural critic, professor in Tampa. You can read her review of Endlings in the LA Times. Maria Reva's novel is out right now. That is it for the show. That's all the time we have. I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdelmahmoud. I'll see you again tomorrow.